everyone for joining. Welcome. We are very excited to have you, and we're really looking forward to presenting you with these research results from Women for Women International. My name is Sabreen Alikhan. I'm the Director of Monitoring, Evaluation, Research and Learning at Women for Women, and we're really pleased and excited to share these research results with you. Before we get started, I want to make a couple of notes about logistics. You will see in the chat that there's a web link available. This link, if you follow it, is for French captioning, if you would like to take advantage of that. We do have live captioning available through this presentation. It's also available in English. If you would like to enable that, please press the button at the bottom of your screen, which indicates English subtitling. And if you click on that link, which is also available in the chat, you'll be taken to a web browser, which allows you to see French captioning. If you're more comfortable in French, that is available to you. The second note I want to make is about the Q&A function in Zoom. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. As we're going through the presentation, if you have questions or comments or anything you would like to share with the panelists, please feel free to type it in there. I will be moderating that throughout the presentation, and we do have some time reserved at the end to go through some questions. So please feel free to share your questions with us throughout the presentation. All right, I want to begin with a little background on who we are, Women for Women International. One moment, I'm just sending the link again. All right. So just to reiterate, if you follow the link that we provided, it opens up a new browser. If you go into the browser and select a change of language from English to French, French captioning will be available to you. Okay, so as a background, Women for Women International is an international NGO. We've been working since 1993 in pursuit of women's empowerment and poverty alleviation, specifically in countries affected by conflict and war. We work exclusively with women living in extreme poverty, women who have faced social marginalization and trauma, to provide these women with training and resources to support their social and economic empowerment. To date, we've reached well over 500,000 women with our programs, and we currently have a presence in 8 countries. These include Afghanistan, Nigeria, South Sudan, and DRC. DRC being the setting of the research that we're discussing today. I also want to say that Women for Women International takes evidence and learning very seriously, and we've been fortunate to have the support of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which funded the research that we're presenting here. So with that, I'd like to introduce Hinke Nauta to provide some opening remarks. Hinke is the coordinator of the Taskforce for Women's Rights and Gender Equality at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is a task force that coordinates the development and implementation of the Dutch international gender policy, which includes programs like Funding Leadership Opportunities for Women, or FLOW, as we call it, which is a program that funded Women for Women International to conduct this research that we're going to talk about today. The FLOW program has been so significant to Women for Women for many reasons, not only because it allowed us to work on different activities that we had not yet tried before programmatically, but it also allowed us to design and implement this research, which has helped us measure the impact of our signature program, which is the first impact evaluation of its kind for our organization. It's very significant for us. So like I said, we've been fortunate to have the support of a partner that shares that deep commitment towards evidence and learning. And I'm really pleased to have Hinke join us and speak to this work and provide a little framing for our discussion. Hinke?
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Hinke Nauta. I'm glad that I have the opportunity to speak to all of you. I know that there are many participants. I don't see them all, but I've heard that there was a great interest for this event. I am the coordinator, indeed, of the Taskforce for Women's Rights and Gender Equality at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are very eager to learn about the results and lessons learned of the Economic and Social Empowerment Program in the DRC. I think it's also thanks to the technology that we can have such a linking and learning session, and that we can have it still in COVID times. So I look forward to learn together and hear about the challenges and results. I myself will highlight some of the current challenges for women's empowerment and gender equality. And then I will tell a bit about the Dutch priorities and our experience with the Funding Leadership and Opportunities for Women program. Gender inequality is one of the most serious forms of discrimination, as it keeps women and girls from reaching their full potential. It keeps them in poverty and at risk, and it deprives them of their basic rights. Yet there is no country in the world that achieved full gender equality. Today, we are halfway the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence campaign. An estimated 243 million women have experienced sexual and physical abuse by an intimate partner at some point in 2019. This increased even further due to lockdowns and isolation measures. Also in the Netherlands, violence against women and girls remains a serious problem. In March, UNESCO estimated that the pandemic was preventing 1.5 billion children from attending school. Some of them will never return. Out of education, girls face an increased risk of female genital mutilation and early marriage. Also, especially, I think, in conflict countries. The lockdown and school closures also mean that women face an increase in their unpaid care work, specifically responsibilities concerning domestic duties, childcare, homeschooling, and looking after sick family members. Besides that, due to the pandemic, women's access to paid work has diminished. However, focusing on COVID-19 gives a false impression that before the pandemic, women's conditions were improving. It suggests that the pandemic is responsible for the rapid reverse of decades of steady progress concerning women's rights and gender equality. But prior to March 2020, women's rights already faced a global pushback from conservative and fundamentalist forces, including in the countries that Women for Women International is working in. For women in poverty and conflict areas, gender inequalities tend to deepen as they have a reinforcing effect on each other. Therefore, we must keep investing in the empowerment of women and in countering gender inequality, so women, men, everyone can enjoy their human rights and reach their full potential. Our continued program, Leading from the South, and the successor of FLOW, Power of Women, will start in 2021, and they will focus even more on financing women's rights organizations and giving voice to Southern-led organizations. Also, the Netherlands, together with Canada, Malawi, and a consortium of NGOs, lead the Generation Equality Action Coalition on feminist movements and leadership. We support investing in women's movements and organizations, not only with our programming, but also in our gender diplomacy. Then about FLOW. We started FLOW in 2015, and together with, I think it were 10 partners, and Women for Women International is one of them, and we are very proud of that. What did we learn? We have learned that during 5 years of FLOW, that individuals are key to combat inequality. Individual empowerment and self-esteem are the stepping stones to create role models, involve households and communities, and to link to global movements. I think Audry Shematsi can tell far better than me how women, but also men, have been or become true agents of change, also thanks to the Economic and Social Empowerment Program in DRC. It is inspiring to see your dedication and results on these important topics in the challenging context of Afghanistan, the DRC, and Nigeria. And I think many people with me, I look forward to an inspiring panel discussion and to learning more about your results, challenges, and especially, of course, the lessons learned for the future. Thank you so much for giving me the floor for this kickoff, and I look forward to hear from the panelists, authors, and participants.
Thank you, Hinke. Thank you so much for joining us. So now I'll go ahead and introduce the rest of our panelists, who you will be hearing from in a bit. So I want to introduce Audry Shematsi, who is the country director of our Women for Women International Office in DRC, where she leads our DRC team in implementing Women for Women's programs there, among many other things. Audry is a passionate activist for gender equity and actually began her work with Women for Women many years ago as a trainer of our program. So we're very fortunate to have Audry with us today. You'll also hear from Eva Noble, who is the Associate Director of Research and Learning at Women for Women International. She has been overseeing our organization's research portfolio, which has also included 2 other randomized control trials. Eva was the project manager for this RCT, which is being discussed, and she has worked closely with the principal investigators and data collection firms. And so you'll be hearing from her when we share the study results. And then we also have Megan O'Donnell, who is the Assistant Director of the Center for Global Development's Gender Program and also a Senior Policy Analyst. She works on issues related to women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion, as well as gender data and measurement. And Megan is joining us to help put our research in context of the broader sector of poverty alleviation and women's empowerment research. So we thank all of our panelists and look forward to getting to the discussion. So first I want to pass it off to Audry, who is going to begin by providing us some background context on DRC and the work that we've been doing there. Audry?
Hello, everyone. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes, we can.
So welcome to the DRC. For those who have loved DRC for quite long, or those who have never been there, I think this 1.5-hour session will get you back to DRC. So you will certainly hear things that you've heard before, or you've heard somewhere in, report or newspaper. Here in South Kivu, there's a way to say welcome. We say karibu, so karibu to all of you. I do want to apologize because I'm not pretty sure about the really internet connectivity. I would like to have my video off. I hope everybody have seen my face. So I need to kind of get off of my video. So I make sure that at least I will be part of this conversation at the end of until the end of the session. So when we talk about the DRC, there's a lot that you hear. What is amazing in the DRC has been like, for the last past 20 years, there's been a lot change in terms of the legal aspect. So because of the sufferings that women went through it and the whole population, the DRC has initiated a lot of process in revising different laws to align to the international and regional legal instruments that promote equal rights. And, we have our constitution that is quite clear in terms of, representation in political and administration of women, participation in economic, it says about social and cultural health, that's actually promoting protection of women and also access to justice. But I think the sad story is, when we look at the indicators, there's not really enough improvement. We're still very low ranked. And there's a lot that can justify that. One of the key things is the conflict. You've heard about the DRC. We have been into 25 years conflict. That have been internal conflict, but also external conflict. But this conflict has actually affected communities and claimed like 5.4 million lives and displaced of millions. For this year, 2020, we have almost 1.8 million people in need and displaced. So Thus, conflict situation has increased challenges with destruction of markets, asset has been destroyed. And this is the whole context. And when we connect it to the services, it's remained poor. When I take an example of educations, women do not really access to education. Not because the infrastructure is poor, but also because the culture prefer to give more privilege to women in a situation where resources are scarce. They prefer to get boys in school than women, which give us a 68% of women who do not complete primary schools. And when we look at in terms of entrepreneurship, we know that in the DRCs, women are more involved in entrepreneurship activities, but they are not really legally protected. There's a lot coming in terms of illegal tax that first. There's no any mechanism to protect women who are really into entrepreneurship. And when they are doing these activities, actually to bring something home, to bring something that the kids will hate. And when we look at, for instance, the violence itself, DRC violence is not really changing a lot, and especially when we're looking domestic violence, which is widespread in the communities. And it's generally accepted that women can accept that a woman can beat up a man can beat up a woman simply because maybe she did not cook well, or she burned the food, or she came late, and this is culturally accepted. And when we actually look at the women's vulnerability to poverty, it's actually reinforced by a complex of lot of barriers: lack of ownership of assets, limited personal income requirement, husbands actually, you have to get your husband buy-in for you to perform certain activity like financial activities. And there's some restriction in terms of mobility, especially in an area where conflict persists. Next slide. Next slide, Sabreen. So we are Women for Women in the DRC. So we've been operating in the DRC since 2004. We have been able to cover 2 provinces, but mostly we are in the South Kivu provinces, where we're implementing our activities in many communities. Can you just go next slide? So in terms of the effective of the office, we have 43 staffers that are really involved to provide services to the vulnerable women. And how do we really provide these services? So you're looking this kind of fluffy, nice picture in front of you. This is what we call our stagnatory programs. And what does that mean exactly? So this program tells that we as organization, we have a powerful combination of direct investment in women. So training and skills building, which is human capital. We do cash stipends and actually channel for savings and loan. We do also access to asset and land, and also networking. But how does it sound really practically? I like to be practical. When we have a woman called Sifa that joined our program, the first she will benefit, will be in a group of 25 women, and she will be in connection with other women. Then that group can provide her a safe space and connection with other women. Then she will learn about story. She'll learn stories from other women. She will get fuel from other women experience. So she will have 12 months attending those kind of meeting with other women. And this will 12 months with her attending the meeting on weekly basis in a group of 25. So the group is very safe and comfortable space. So women learn about essential health practices and nutrition, fundamental human rights, and some of the fundamental health practices at household and community levels. And on the other side, the woman will also have to participate on training in numeracy, business management skills, planning, selling product in the market, bookkeeping, group business, and cooperative. She will receive 4 to 70 hours of hands and professional and vocational training. And this vocational training has selected those in the market assessment that we conducted. And in many communities, what options do we offer women at either tailoring, soap making, producing handbags, small business for women. So this what will benefit, but based on the market assessment finding, which we conduct before even starting the vocational program. So each woman will receive a training stipend, as I said, for 10 months, but we will also organize those women into a landing group, which we all maybe have heard about that. It's a sort of village 7 group, for them to be able to save the 10 money from the $10 stipend that they receive. So this is broadly what we provide our services to women that are enrolled in a 12-month that I call 12 months journey of transformation to become a strong woman. But acknowledging the fact that providing women economic empowerment can actually bring some of the backlash at family level, especially in the private space. So alongside the stagnatory program, we also run the means engagement program. So we work with male leaders, train male leaders in the community, and actually maximize on the influence in the community on social and practice in the communities, and train them on women's rights. Specific rights are inheritance rights, decision making, participatory decision in terms of family planning. So these leaders, in turn, will train male community members and male partners of participants. When I'm saying participant, as the women that attended our program. So we work with the spouse of the participant. So we will train them to be able to support women transformation processes. Next slide. So I think this is a little bit of, I think I'm having a problem with my internet. Lucky that I have my note here. So I think this is a broadly in terms of what we're doing in the DRC. We have the core program, and in parallel of the core program, we also running the means engagement program. Thank you, Sabreen.
Thank you, Audrey. So now if I can transition to Eva, who is going to share more about the research itself and the results.
Sure, thank you so much. So thank you, Audrey, for giving us such a vivid context for the setting in the DRC and for describing this program. So for this research project, for this endeavor, what we're talking about is an evaluation of the signature program that Audrey has described. This research study was part of a cross-country learning agenda where we were working with 2 fantastic researchers at the University of Washington and the University of Texas at Austin to conduct a 24-month randomized control trial, or RCT, of this signature program, as well as our men's engagement program. As previously detailed, this impact evaluation was conducted under a 5-year investment by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands under their FLOW program. The primary objective of this RCT was to measure the impact of Women for Women International's signature program on the key outcome areas of the signature program's theory of change. So women's livelihoods, savings and assets, social empowerment, well-being, and social assets, 1 full year after the program was completed. The secondary objective to this research is to examine how these men's engagement activities happening concurrently with the women's program also impacted women's outcomes. This research took place in 4 locations in South Kivu, in Kamanyola, Luchiga, Nyangezi, and Momosho. And all participants in this study were women who were 18 years or older, mostly below 55 years of age. And we really targeted 1 woman per household to ensure, to try to reduce the effects of spillover as much as possible. In terms of the ethics of this study, at every stage, the women were given a choice to participate. They provided their informed consent before any sort of research activities took place. They were told they're able to withdraw at any time and their program participation would not be affected. And we had reviews and ethics approvals from the DRC Ministry of Public Health, their Committee of National Ethics, as well as the University of Texas at Austin, IRB. Additionally, and quite important for Women, we chose to use a waitlist design. So control group participants were waitlisted and are participating in the program after the RCT completed. The data collection activities were conducted by 2 incredible data collection firms, Maracuja Kivu Research and Innovative Hub for Research in Africa. So overall, this was about 24 months of study, give or take, as there were a couple rounds of data collection to match when women started the program. So this took place between July 2017 and November 2019, starting with the recruitment of 2,039 eligible women eligible for the Women for Women program, who were then randomly allocated into a treatment arm of 1,000 women and a control arm of 1,039 women. These women were interviewed at baseline, and then they were basically put into their treatment arms. So the 1,000 women in the overall treatment arm, meaning participation in the Women for Women signature program, were further divided into 500 women randomized to have a spouse in that 4 months of men's engagement program, so-called MEP, and 500 women whose spouse or household member did not participate in MEP. So then there was the 12-month signature program. There was 4 months of MEP for those in the MEP arm. And then a midline survey was conducted, which actually is just after the program completed. So middle of the research study, but end of the intervention. And then 1 year passed and data was collected from 88% of the original respondents in our endline survey. Additionally, randomly selected participants and spouses, 32 program participants and 16 spouses were interviewed with in-depth interviews qualitatively. So as I mentioned at the top, this study really centered on looking at the outcomes of Women for Women signature program theory of change. So looking to see how this program impacts women's savings, assets, access to credit, earnings and ways of working, health and well-being, self-confidence and agency, decision-making in the home, as well as social support and networks. In addition, as the signature program is rooted in this larger investment, looking at attitudes, violence in the community and such, we also looked at outcome areas, including those, so gender attitudes and intimate partner violence. And due to the strength and interest of our wonderful principal investigators, we also looked at the outcomes of mental health for women. So what is the population within this study? Overall, the average age was 33, and about half of the women in this study were below 30 years of age. 57% of the participants are illiterate, and only 14% of women attained an education higher than primary school, which I hope places this population in the context of the statistics Audrey presented about South Kivu broadly. The average household size was 6.4 people, and the average income earned in the past week for the baseline respondents was $1.57 using US dollars, or 2,510 Congolese francs. Keep in mind that the global poverty line is $1.90 a day, and we're talking about less than that for weekly earnings. Only 9% of participants held any personal savings. And at baseline, what we saw is that many women hold gender attitudes that reflect the kind of environment that Audrey was discussing, where about 2/3 of women agree that a man should have the final say on household decisions, or agree that a man can beat his wife for refusing sex. And one of the things that I find most important to highlight when looking at the factors and the characteristics of this population is that at baseline, almost all of the participants, 98% of the participants, had reported experiencing a serious economic shock in the prior year. That included significant price changes in the market, income loss, illness, displacement of a household member, being affected by ongoing conflict. And so as we dive into the results, it's really important to remember that context, that this is a setting in which large economic shocks are happening quite frequently to the populations, and they have to learn and adapt and keep going through those shocks. So before I switch over to talk about the results, I just want to put a quick framing of how I'll be sharing the results. So as I showed in the diagram, the study was split first into women in the treatment arm, 1,000 women who are in the signature program, and the control arm. And then those two treatment groups were further divided down into two treatment groups. For this section of slides that I'm presenting next, I am presenting the main effects of this overall treatment group, which combines the women in the signature program and the MEP arm, the women in the signature program with a spouse and MEP. We did this primarily because the findings actually did not show a large impact of the MEP, and so we were able to combine and look at the overall treatment group against the control group first, and then take a look at the secondary research question of the MEP arm versus the MEP arm. This isn't indicated in the following slides, so I'll also say this at the front. All reported results in the following slides are statistically significant at the 5% level unless they are specified otherwise. So what we're looking at going forward is this control versus treatment, overall treatment. So what did we see? The first thing that we saw is that the women who participated in the program increased their earnings and made shifts towards more entrepreneurship. Women who had been through this, women through the signature program, had weekly gross earnings 1.6 times higher than women in the control arm at N-line, which is reflected in this graph on the right. And on this graph, this will hold for all presented graphs. The orange line shows the 1,000 women in the signature program in the treatment arm, and the gray line shows the control group women, so women who received no Women for Women programming over the course of the study at the 3 time points: baseline, midline, which was end of program, and end line 1 year after the program concluded. This change in income may be due to a shift towards some more lucrative entrepreneurial endeavors, as there was almost a 40% shift from wage labor to self-employment. And one thing that we found that was quite interesting was, though average earnings increased quite significantly, the percent of women who reported earnings in the prior week remained actually around 40 to 50% at each point in time. So what that signals, A, is methodologically asking about weekly earnings to irregular or seasonal or agricultural earners is a difficult way to paint a full picture of what's going on economically. But 2, it's very possible that the program is really impacting some women positively for their economic gains, but not all. And so that's something that we're thinking about going forward, who we might be leaving behind and how to lift them up as well. Qualitatively, women reported new skills gained that allowed them to start businesses. And as I read some of these qualitative quotes, I ask that you please forgive some of the language, as these have gone from Swahili or Lingala to French to English. And so some of the precision in phrasing has been a little bit lost. One woman said, "The important thing I learned is the skill I've acquired through weaving baskets. Today, I can go out here to Luvunge, and if I have a little money, I buy threads, weave, and I can sell. The Women for Women program helped a lot in giving me work intelligence. Women who participated in the treatment arm also reported an increase in having savings, the amount of savings, their assets, as well as more access to credit. Twice as many households reported having savings for the treatment group, 80% as compared to 40% in the control group at the end. The value of savings also increased quite significantly. At endline, you can see the treatment group is reporting almost 3 times higher average earnings than the control arm. So it's about a doubling of household saving value and a tripling of women's personal savings value. In terms of assets, there were also significant increases in household livestock values, as well as increases in women's participation in a VSLA, which provides a vehicle for savings and access to loans, a key component of financial inclusion. We also found in the treatment arm that women increased land ownership, with reporting having their name on a land deed. Women also reported feeling more in control of their lives, increased participation in household decisions, and qualitatively talked about improved self-confidence. When we use a measure called the locus of control, which is a set of 4 questions, which gives a comparison of 2 statements that reflect feeling in control of your life in the future or feeling not in control of your life or the future, we found that women had a 10% higher score in the intervention arm than the control arm. And while that numerically feels small, statistically, it's a very significant finding, actually. The program also increased participation in household decision-making with a 0.15 standard deviation, or actually a p-value below 1%. On this decision-making index. And while that is quite a wonky way to describe decision-making, the way that I like to explain this actually is that decision-making participation typically in a population, when you look across households, increases with age, where women who are older tend to have a bit more decision-making power in their household. What the program actually did is it gave women in 1 year of program the same gain they likely would have achieved in 6 years without the program. And one example scenario in terms of making the decision-making index, which is compiled of 4 questions, is asking who's involved in the decisions regarding women working outside the home. For example, the location, the hours, the type of work, whether she's allowed to work outside the home. And what we see is in the intervention arm at the end, that's 80% versus 74% in the control arm. And qualitatively, women spoke a lot about increased senses of self-reliance. For example, I did not know women could manage money. I used to expect everything from my husband, but now I hear nothing from him. I prefer to develop my own ways of feeding my children instead of waiting for the return of my husband. We also saw that women's rates of anxiety decreased and household diets became more diverse. The treatment arm showed a decrease in the prevalence of mild, moderate, or severe anxiety as measured using the generalized anxiety disorder scale. We did not see that the program affected the prevalence of depressive symptoms. Those were quite high in both groups and they remained that way throughout. We also had looked at, but did not see that the program affected physical activities for women, physical capabilities. But there was a significant increase in the mean household diet diversity score amongst women in the treatment group. And this is also reflected qualitatively with many women talking about changing their diets for their household, having access to more foods, cooking differently. For example, I used to eat food without oil, and now I can prepare my vegetables. I have salt or oil and a measure of flour. I know how to vary the food today, like beans, corn, sombe, and others, and the health of my family is improving. So we also saw that the program increased women's participation in groups and showed increases in social support. Women were more likely to be participating in community-based social groups, whether that was savings groups, religious groups, or other types of community groups. Women in the program also reported having someone they could borrow money from in an emergency and more likely to have a place to sleep if they could not sleep in their own home for the night. Qualitatively, women shared how they have become important members of their community. For example, members of the community can borrow money from me without problems. Women for Women pushed me forward. I became important in the neighborhood now, while I used to be the most neglected of us and no one would come close to me. And another woman had shared, in my community, we say that Women for Women makes us leave the ground. I am a model to women, a teacher who educates other women to become respected to everyone. So now turning over to some of the outcome areas that I mentioned at the beginning in the lighter yellow. So outcome areas that were not part of our signature theory of change, but were included in this RCT. What we saw is that the program, for one specific gender attitude, the belief that a woman can be a community leader, we saw the program significantly increase the percent of women holding that belief. However, the program did not change overall gender attitudes for women in this period of time, and the program did not lower the prevalence of reported experiences of intimate partner violence, as reflected in this graph below. And it's important to note with intimate partner violence that we did not capture these at baseline, so these are midline and endline percentages presented instead. Talking about intimate partner violence, I think it's important to not only talk about the prevalence, but also the types of violence that women were participating and continue to experience, where approximately 1/3 of participants were reporting some kind of IPV in the past 12 months, whether it was physical, sexual, emotional, or economic. And so there were a couple examples that really stood out to describe what women are experiencing. There was one day that I refused to turn to him and make love. He began to say that maybe I have other men. It did not feel good, and when I explained, he did not understand. So I had to do it to avoid problems. And another woman said, he never beats me, but he speaks too badly. That hurts me, and so I've come home to my family once. So remembering that this is quite a wide spectrum of ways that women experience violence, in thinking about how to prevent, reduce, and respond to violence going forward. So now going back to the layout of this study, I'm now going to talk about that secondary research objective, which is what is the impact on women's outcomes to have a spouse participating in this men's engagement program. So looking at the 500 women in the signature program only against the 500 women with a spouse in that MEP arm. So on this slide, I'm presenting 4 graphs, and I'm only presenting the lines of women in the signature program in blue and women who also had a male household member, primarily a spouse, in the men's engagement in orange. These graphs do not reflect the control group anymore. And what we saw actually was that the participation in the men's engagement program in that form did not have additional impacts on women's outcomes. This holds true across savings, earnings, violence, decision-making in the household. What we really learned was that the program in that form may have had impacts on the men, but it did not translate to those gains in women's outcomes. So overall, when we take a step back and we look at all of these results, what has this RCT taught us? It's taught us that the Women for Women International signature program has increased households and personal savings, assets, and access to credit. It has increased women's earnings and shifted the ways that women are working. It has increased women's participation in decision-making and shifted confidence and boosted agency and improved social support and diets. We also see in the lighter green some outcome areas where some outcomes were really positively affected and others were not. For example, with physical well-being, we see improved household diets, but do not see improvements in physical health for women. And similarly with mental health, we see reduced rates of anxiety, but not rates of depression changed. And then in terms of areas that we take forward as areas of improvement, areas to think about, adapt, expand programming, we did not significantly change women's attitudes on gender norms or change reported rates of intimate partner violence. And the men's engagement program in its form that was used during the RCT did not lead to additional gains for women's outcomes. So when we look at these results overall, what we can take away is that this RCT has validated many key areas in the signature program theory of change. And we ask ourselves, why do we think that is? First of all, we think that one of the key components for Women International's program is that it's a women-driven program. The programming is shaped based on women's stated needs. It has evolved significantly over time based on what participants ask for. And the program respects women's strength and resilience, and it meets women where they are. Second, women often have missed a formal education, and so Women International provides this foundational training at the beginning on things like numeracy, saving money, setting goals, and budgeting, as well as growing that training into vocational and more advanced business skills. In a fragile or conflict-affected setting, the savings and assets are essential for women to cope with the economic shocks that are always ongoing. This bundled approach helps women achieve some economic self-sufficiency and withstand these shocks. Third, we find that the integration of a gender transformative program with very intentional gender equality in mind with a poverty alleviation effort is critical, as women's poverty in the fragile and conflict-affected settings, it's compounded by gender norms. It's compounded by an environment that continues to uphold and perpetrate gender discrimination. The bundled approach supports the building of women's social power in addition to building economic skills and economic power. And the last point that we want to draw out is that there's a lot of power in women coming together to support one another, especially in a conflict setting where women in households might be quite isolated. It's critical to think about group-based programming, whether that's classroom training, VSLAs, things like that, as a way to create social and financial support, provide a way for women to build networks so they have emergency support, as well as support women as they build towards collective and community engagement. So we aren't just reflecting on the results that looked really positive for the program. We also are reflecting on growth areas going forward and what we've pulled out of the results, and would love in the discussion or in the Q&A to hear from everyone on their thoughts, whether we have other areas we should be thinking about, or whether there are approaches or suggestions audience members may hold for us in terms of these growth areas. But what we're putting forward is that we want to look beyond gains in average earnings, and we want to identify and support women individually so that we're not just excited about an increase in average gains, but we're seeing that the majority of women in the program are increasing their earning potential throughout. We also want to strengthen the mental health assessment and response within this women's empowerment programming, especially noting the challenges that will pose for us in a conflict setting where resources and practitioners are quite limited. It's important to intentionally design for this gender-based violence reduction, and we look to implement proven programmatic approaches to reduce IPV as we go forward. This also includes really expanding out some other elements of the FLOW program, for example, training women to be community change agents, expanding the men's engagement, hosting community forums with leaders and getting their buy-in and engagement around gender norms. So as I mentioned, we'll also be looking at expanding and deepening the men's engagement programming and thinking about the larger household and community environments in which women live, and really fostering that enabling environment for women to apply the lessons and apply the gains from the signature program and access their rights and raise their voices. And the last thing, which is not a programmatic reflection, but actually a measurement one, is that this research also fostered a sense of importance for us in strengthening certain measurement approaches. So specifically, we want to think about better assessments of women's earning potential as irregular earners. We want to think about localized conceptions of mental health as well as standardized measurement tools. And we also would like to improve and expand the ways that we measure women's agency and decision-making, as these are just areas that hold a lot of nuance and complexity, and the simplification of standard tools is really helpful for comparisons and standardization. but also we would like to dive into that nuance as we think about programming adaptations going forward. So that is it for me. I'll turn it back over to Sabreen. The last thing I just want to say before handing it over is simply, it has been a joy and a privilege to oversee this project. And there are so many people to thank for working on this project. And Sabreen will thank many people at the end, but I just want to highlight two really important groups of people. The first are the participants. We owe them such a debt of gratitude for their time and sharing their experiences so we can learn about the program and its effects. And the second is the data collection teams. The data collectors are incredible. They safely, efficiently, collect data from these women in conflict areas, in areas that were neighboring an Ebola outbreak. They were asking difficult and sensitive questions, and they were doing it all professionally with smiles on their faces, whether it was raining, whether there was no power in their guest house. So I just really salute the data collection teams as well. And I'll turn it back over to you, Sabreen. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Eva, and definitely echo all the thanks there. It's taken a lot of work and effort to put these results together, and just want to thank everyone who had something to do with putting this together. So there's a lot to unpack about these results, and I want to bring in Megan to help speak to how this research that we just presented fits into and contributes to other current evidence on women's empowerment and poverty alleviation efforts. So how does this fit into the wider perspective of research in this area?
Thanks, Sabreen. And Eva and Audrey and Women for Women for having me participate in today's discussion. Before I kind of dive into my own reflections on the evaluation results, just really want to commend the organization for placing such a priority on rigorous evaluation. And of course, the Dutch government for making it possible, through funding this research. So at the Center for Global Development, where I sit, which is a think tank focused on development economics, we have a team of folks who regularly runs RCTs like these on different interventions aimed at improving women's economic opportunities and outcomes. And then for the past several years, we've also placed a really heavy emphasis on synthesizing the existing evidence that's out there. So back in 2013, it started with a colleague of mine, Myra Buvanich, and others at the UN Foundation, launching a report that many of you may be familiar with, a roadmap for promoting women's economic empowerment. We did an update of that in 2016 because fortunately there was a proliferation of evidence on these topics that let us be more and more confident about what works and what doesn't when we're seeking to improve women's economic outcomes. And our latest work out in 2020 took a deep dive into the West African region, so synthesized the evidence specific to countries there. And now, with COVID top of mind for so many of us, we're approaching this work now with that kind of crisis and COVID lens. So that's where I approach these issues from. And in thinking about how this specific RCT sort of fits in and is situated or consistent with the rest of the evidence that we reviewed, I'd say sort of as a main takeaway to start, the Women for Women bundling approach is really the only way. It is the required way of reaching the types of women that you all are focused on, right? Folks who are facing compounding and particularly severe barriers as they live in difficult contexts, in crisis contexts, extremely low income, maybe limited skills, limited access to networks and information through them. So this bundling approach, we often need to sort of butt up against arguments that say, well, it's not a silver bullet, it's not cost effective, it's so complex. But at the end of the day, my sort of go-to response is always the financial literacy training in isolation, or the discussions with male partners in isolation, a savings account or a small asset transfer on its own is very unlikely to be able to sort of butt up against those compounding and complex constraints that these particular demographics of women face. So the bundled approach, probably the only way to go. And so that's entirely consistent with the research that we've seen. I'll highlight two aspects of that sort of bundled approach, one that Audrey and Eva touched on, and then one that maybe we could explore a bit more in discussion. The first is, of course, what Women for Women facilitates in terms of access to networks. And there's a growing and sort of promising evidence base about the fact that women in isolation, even if they are receiving some sort of capital grant, asset transfer, and capacity building in terms of training, without access to that network that can provide peer support, mentorship, there will be limitations on sort of their risk taking, their self-esteem, their confidence to be able to sort of refuse the gender discriminatory norms in their communities and wider contexts. And so that network effect is pretty powerful, and one that I know, researchers joining this call and listening in are also exploring, and one that at CGD, we placed a priority on as well. The second that didn't come up as much, but has been a big priority area in the synthesis reviews that we've done, is recognizing women's unpaid care work in the background of how these interventions are implemented, often recognizing that if that unpaid care work isn't accounted for and sort of designed for within a particular intervention, attrition rates are pretty high. I mean, women don't often have the types of support where they can attend a pretty heavy or lengthy training session for days on end, and so therefore may have to drop out. And when it's not just a program that is targeted to women, but is also sort of gender neutral in its reach and reaching men, we see that women are falling out at rates higher than those of men because they don't have the same sort of childcare, elder care, broader unpaid care work responsibilities. So a question about how Women for Women has considered sort of whether it's on-site childcare or putting training sites very close to home, designing in that way so that those unpaid care work burdens are accounted for. I'll transition now a bit to a couple of the points that Eva raised where you all did not, at least yet, see as much impact. And I think that those areas are also entirely consistent with the broader evidence base. I think on both violence and male engagement sort of facets of the evaluation, we can view things in sort of both negative but also positive lights. I mean, the first is to say that these types of gender norms underlying intimate partner and other forms of gender-based violence, and the broader gender norms that lead to sort of intra-household conflicts between women and their spouses and other male family members, they're very sticky, right? A year or 4 months of discussion is not likely to be able to move the needle in a really sustained fashion. And that's, cause for concern, but also not entirely surprising. So I think the question is, what else needs to be done, or on what time frame, for what duration, where we can really see meaningful change for those stickier norms and facets of intra-household dynamics. In a more positive light, I mean, what I was encouraged by this RCT and others that we've been reviewing, that has been a big priority for our team at CGD lately, is the fact that this intervention did not seem to increase intimate partner violence or other forms of gender-based violence within the household. That is encouraging because, feminist researchers and advocates, practitioners for years have sort of had this question mark and this open conversation about whether increased violence is a risk or an unintended consequence of allocating more resources, providing more skills and other forms of support to women. Does that butt up against some of those community norms where women are not seen as entitled to those things, where they are maybe competition or sort of a threat to men's power within households and communities? And I think this RCT is one that can be added to a growing evidence base that suggests, no, we shouldn't be fearful necessarily of that unintended consequence and use it as a reason to not do this type of economic support programming. Of course, we want to be considerate of it. We want to design to be able to mitigate its risk, but we should go forward and sort of feel confident about the benefits of these programs largely outweighing any sort of costs. And I would make that same point as it relates to male engagement. This might be something we can discuss in the Q&A a bit further. If the male engagement piece over a 4-month period did not entirely change, not just male attitudes, but women's outcomes as a result, did it at least sort of mitigate against any sort of risk of unintended consequence? I mean, is there data analysis that can sort of be followed on, be picked apart a bit more, where we see less risk of violence or male backlash or any kind of reactionary attitudes because men were engaged through that 4-month process? So open question there. And I think will be interesting, in the coming months and years as Promundo and the husband schools coming out of the World Bank's Sahel Women's Empowerment and Demographic Dividend Project, which is now up to 1,500 schools that are aimed at this same male engagement component. We're going to have more and more evidence that suggests what's working, for what duration, on what scale. And so hopefully that can inform sort of future efforts for Women and other similar organizations. I'll say one last thing on the measurement piece before turning to kind of the COVID lens, and then pass it back to you, Sabreen, and others to discuss more interactively. Eva touched on this. I mean, I think I echo what she alluded to briefly in saying we need context-specific measures. We need to make sure that the specific questions that enumerators are posing make sense to the women that they're interviewing, that we're using the terminology and kind of the framing of empowerment and agency and mental health that makes sense, because these are such abstract, I think, amorphous concepts for any of us, regardless of where we sit, and even if we're allegedly experts on these topics. So how do we increasingly sort of meet women where they are, as Eva said it at the end of her presentation, including in the way that we're posing these questions to them? I think that can be complemented very nicely. And we'll actually have a conversation virtually later today on this through CGD's platform, by a set of concise, harmonized indicators at global level, where we can start to sort of compare apples to apples increasingly. So of course, the specific questions are going to need to be context specific, but I wonder, the extent to which us as women's economic empowerment researchers, practitioners, advocates can start to kind of come together around a shared set of priority indicators, so that we can start to see, progress sort of cross-culturally and cross-context over time. To what extent can we harmonize increasingly the measurement tools that we're using? Finally, on the COVID front, I think Hinke started with a very excellent point of saying, look, everything may be magnified now. We may be realizing that women are increasingly economically vulnerable to crisis, that the threat of intimate partner and other forms of gender-based violence is increasing, but these are not new problems, right? It is not COVID's fault that these things are now sort of receiving more media attention. The shadow pandemic of violence was always there. The gender gaps in the economy, in pay, in advancement, in opportunity were always there. And so I think that's very much sort of the vantage point we have to proceed through. I think where I'm really encouraged by Women for Women's work, with that perspective, is you all are very well positioned, more so than some counterparts, to already be operating in crisis, to already know what bundling of interventions is needed in particularly vulnerable settings. And so I think lessons coming out of this RCT and hopefully future evaluations of your work can help to inform broader poverty alleviation, broader economic recovery and development programs, as folks seek to question what do we do for the most vulnerable in the most trying set of circumstances. So I'll end there, and happy to follow up and continue to discuss.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's really important to hear your perspective, because you have this bird's eye view of all the other research and how these results are actually fitting into and tracking with other studies and the directions that these studies are going in. And you raised a lot of important points that I hope we have time to dig into a little bit more about. Obviously, the men's engagement piece is a big talking point, but also about women's unpaid work and getting into some of that. Now I want to switch to Audry to be able to tell us a little bit more about how these results were actually shared with the communities in which the research was conducted. So Audry and our DRC team actually shared these research findings in the communities where the research happened in South Kivu. And I want to hear from her, how did the communities respond to this? And what did the women themselves have to say about the results of the study? I think you are still on mute, Audry. There you go.
As you said, we shared the result in the 4 communities that were subjected to the research, because we found it really important to take the result back to the community, as we can do this research project and have this interesting learning without the program and research participant. So while we weren't really able to share the result with every participant, especially due to restricted number of meetings, we hosted 1 meeting in each community where research was conducted to share the results. The kind of sharing of results is part of, I think, the accountability to the women we work with, and also provides us a critical feedback to understand the result. So some of the interesting things that came from the community, I'm going to call this from the change agent. A change agent is actually a woman who has gone through a 12-month program and later on decided to be actively engaged, bringing change in the community. So we have more than 100 change agents in all the community we are intervening. So she says something about the result, said, especially on the men's engagement program result. She said she wasn't really surprised about the result because referring to what she sees in the community, men are willing to accept and concede some of the power dimension when it's about, getting a girls in school, but there's still some sensitive area like land which is culturally rules. And she said, really have to emphasize on those aspects. And one of the key things she actually highlighted as land reflect identity and reflect power. And power belongs to men. So we should be very observant in terms of the transformation process to get a man to accept that a woman can also own the power over land. But there was also some contradictory. I mean, other female thought that, oh, wow, we're surprised to see the men's engagement result was not that significant. But we are seeing men who have been part of those programs, they're acting differently. This is actually some of the feedback that we got from the community. And way forward, I'm going to highlight it. We, especially for the main program, we are actually trying to, I don't know whether it's a very, it's acceptable language, but to refurbish the program so that we can be consistent in the future. So the 2 feedback that I'm sharing came from the community levels, but we had also some meetings to discuss the result at provincial levels. And there was an interesting one in terms of, coming from the other practitioners working in gender-based violence or gender equity. They said that was really interesting. And as an organization, we have to think about providing a shared learning platform with organizations who are doing the similar work. Here, we're doing social and economic empowerment of women. So those are the 2 insights that I got that I wanted to share, but we got a lot of feedback from different meetings that we had at different levels. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Audrey. And a follow-up question, which I think is a natural question resulting from this, these findings, is what is our plan moving forward? What does the Women for Women DRC team plan in terms of programming in response to these research findings? What's next for our work?
I think this was a very good, interesting feedback that we got from the research. As a program, an organization, we're concerned to really change women's life, transform them so that they can be fully confident and fully acting in the community. First of all, it's actually brought us to hear from women about the services we're giving them. We also learn about the transformative power of the program. So as moving forward, priority is to continue to provide robust and contextualized programming for women, especially as community recovery from the economic shock of the pandemic, as well as increase in violence toward women. We need also to provide programming that support and lift women holistically. I'm sorry, I have to put my camera off because I have a message that's telling me my internet is not well. So the second thing is that as a country levels, we're discussing about how to expand this program to other places beyond the South Kivu province where we have been quite long, but also looking at other provinces like the North Kivu. We've been in North Kivu provinces, but we want to also go back again in North Kivu and reach out to more community. The second thing is that in terms of the look going forward, our team is eager to learn from these findings and adapt our programming where the results showed us opportunity to grow and better serve the women and community where we work. Men's engagement will be a large focus, of course. Expanding and focusing program on how men attitude, behavior change can lead to positive impact for women. Learning from the evidence base on what program models have shown positive change for both men and women and applying lessons. We're also looking to target households, community levels, norms to affect behavior change and really reducing in GBV by growing community advocacy via change agent forums, leaders, and commitment. We're also interested to explore ways to support women's mental health in context with such limited services provider. We're also looking into identifies and provide more individualized support for women at different levels of earning income. This is actually broadly what we are planning to do moving forward.
That's great. Thank you, Audrey, for providing that. I want to now, I realize we don't have a lot of time, but I want to move to a couple of questions if I can. This first question came in the chat, and I will throw this to Eva to see if she can respond. We got a question that was, do you see any evidence that the effects of the program differ by the types or intensity of shocks that women experience? Follow-up is, based on other experiences, do you think the effects of the program differ between DRC and other contexts. So both about shocks and about context.
Sure, thank you so much. And thank you for these great questions. So the first question in terms of looking at the results and disaggregating by experiences of shocks, this is actually something that we took a look at in the analysis. It was not part of the pre-analysis plan, so it wasn't fully powered to look at that. But what we actually found was that economic shocks looked more like an outcome area than a participant characteristic, which is really interesting and requires a lot more digging into the data before we put out anything conclusive there. But what it actually looks like in the data from the preliminary looks that we did with the PIs is that actually women through the intervention arm were reporting lower experiences of shocks overall, which is just something that is incredibly interesting and surprising, considering the shocks are often quite environmental. So there's more to unpack there, but love that question. Thank you so much for asking. In terms of how these results compare to the program in other settings, so we have actually a completed RCT in Afghanistan that was conducted under DFID's What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls program. And similar, actually, what we see is quite similar in terms of a mapping of areas that have significance. So significant impacts on women's earnings, savings, decision-making in the household. In Afghanistan, we also saw some impacts around mobility and social connections. And similarly, in Afghanistan, did not see that the program model was affecting IPV. So the results in the DRC generally for a lot of those outcome areas show larger impacts and like bigger percentage changes and more significant changes, but they align quite well in terms of the overall story to tell of outcome areas impacted and outcome areas that were not impacted. We have an additional control trial in Nigeria that is ongoing. So once that study is completed next year, we'll be able to also add that into the mix when we take a look at the programming overall. And the last piece I'll add is that in addition to the RCTs, Women for Women has a very robust M&E system that's always ongoing with the programming. And so this M&E is collecting data from 30% of program participants globally before the program, at the end of the program, and actually up to 24 months after the program. And what we see in the RCT is quite a similar mapping to the M&E data, where the one difference, and it's not so much a difference in results, but a difference in how the data was collected, is this men's engagement finding. So what we see in our M&E surveys, which are getting information from men participating in the program, is that they self-report changes in behaviors, in attitudes. But what this RCT is showing us, and again, this is a difference in who we're talking to and how the data is collected, is that even if men are self-reporting these changes, it's not yet translating into additional impacts for women. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for addressing that. There's so much to unpack and we don't have a ton of time. So I want to move to another question that we got in the chat, which was around how we actually engage men to participate in our men's engagement trainings and forums and such. So I think this will be a question for Audrey primarily, but anyone else can jump in. How does Women for Women actually incentivize men to want to participate in this kind of program? And a follow-on that I'll add is, do we think that incentivization should switch or be improved or anything in response to these findings that we see? How do we get men on our side?
Yeah, this is Audrey. My team is on the discussion, so they can jump in anytime. So what we do first of all, we prioritize to work with men spouses of our participants, and organize a kind of cascading training approach where we target first training traditional leaders in the community who will be trained as facilitators. And then there will be others after that organizing discussion and training with different men's group. So I don't know whether I provided an answer, but the men's group, it's actually composed 80% of participant spouses. That is one of the criteria. We also select men's household representative. Could be a uncle, I don't know, uncle or some family relatives for widows who do not have a husband. But mostly we work with the spouses of the participant. And as I said, the program is in complementarity to the core program. So in the discussion, we get them to understand women's right, women economic right, importance of equal participations, equal decision-making at household levels, but also we touch on the land right aspect. This is briefly what I can say.
All right, thank you, Audrey. And thank you, Eva. I'll move now to just wrap up. And I know that we received a few more questions, but what we can do is type up the questions in an email, respond to them via email, and then circulate that among those of you who have participated today. So I want to thank everyone for joining. This has been, like we said, very significant for us as an organization to have generated this kind of evidence and contribute to the evidence base on women's empowerment programming. And the biggest thanks is due to the participants of the research, those who gave their time and their information to help make this research possible. We are so grateful to them for their participation. And also just another shout out to the DRC data collection firms, Maracuja and IHFRA. They have been wonderful partners in this, and we owe them so much gratitude. Also, the principal investigators, the researchers who led this research, these are Doctors Rachel Heath and Manuela Angelucci. We thank them for their leadership, as well as Audrey and her team, Thomas Willanja. And thank you, of course, to the Dutch government for helping to fund this important research for us. So what's next for us and for these results? Actually, this Friday, one of our principal investigators, Rachel Heath, is going to be presenting a more econometrics-focused presentation of these results at a conference. That's this Friday. It's hosted by IPA and a few other partners. You can search for that and join if you'd like. We will also be hosting a few more events related to these results. So one will be in DRC, which will be similar to this, but it will be hosted in DRC and in French. We will also be hosting another webinar. Stay tuned for this. This is called What's Under the Hood, more of a behind the scenes look at how we implemented this research. That is really bringing in the voices of those who were most involved on the ground of this research to sort of celebrate what it takes to put a big research effort like this together. And then finally, the final analysis of these results and a detailed research paper is currently being developed for publication, and we will be circulating that when that's ready about early next year. And then to wrap up, everyone you heard from today is available on Twitter. So you can follow all of us, Women for Women, Center for Global Development, and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. You can also find these links for more information, especially womenforwomen.org/impact evaluations should give you more information about this research, but also a lot of other research and evaluation that we've done at Women for Women International. Also, please check out the CGD website for more resources like those that Megan was speaking about. And please do visit the website for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands if you want to find out more about the programs related to women's empowerment that they have been funding. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining. We do want to hear from you if you have any additional questions or comments. please do email us at research@womenforwomen.org. We would love to hear from you. And in the meantime, this session has been recorded. We will circulate this among everyone who registered so that you have that. So thank you so much to the panelists for your time. Thank you everyone for joining.